Do you want your base to be self-sufficient and practically have an infinite food source? Well, I have a video for you. Farming is so incredibly useful, not to mention pretty much necessary if you're trying to make windmills. And it's really simple, and some people overcomplicate it. However, it's really easy to get into, and I'm here to show you how. The first thing that you're gonna need to know is that there is different kinds of soils, and it greatly affects how quickly your farms are gonna grow and how much nutrients that it gives your plants. If you find something like this, it's just called the forest floor. You cannot plant any crops onto it. So if you live in a forest, you might have to do some adventuring to find a soil that's actually workable. This is the worst of them all, other than the one that literally doesn't work. This is low fertility soil. It will do in a pinch. However, I would recommend that you try to skip it at all costs. This is the one that most people will start with. It's called medium fertility soil. You can see that it is noticeably darker, and it's pretty easy to spot. It can hold more nutrition, and this is what you should go for. There is two kinds of other soil. They are extremely rare. You can see that the high fertility soil is slightly darker than the medium fertility soil. However, it can be easily mistaken, but it is extremely rare, and unless you do an insane amount of exploring or get insanely lucky, the odds of you finding this is kind of slim, at least in bulk, because you're not going to be finding giant biomes of it. You're just going to find patches, and you're going to need to find a lot of patches if you only want to use high fertility soil. Terra preta is the best one of them all, and it's not even called soil. And for this, you actually craft it. It takes charcoal powder, bone meal, and compost. It is extremely expensive, and you don't get much of it, but the goal is to eventually replace all of your farmland with it. Now, I wanted to show you real quick the differences. You can see when you hover over it, it has a number. Low fertility soil only gets 25% of its fertility. Medium goes up to 50%. High fertility goes up to 65%. And Terra preta goes up to 80%. However, the difference between medium and Terra preta is only 19%, which is why medium soil is completely fine to work with. 19% seems nice, but that's only a couple extra days and isn't that big of a deal. However, the nutrients is very nice. So if you can't make Terra preta, go for it. But if you can't, it's not that big of a deal. So after you've gotten your soil, you're gonna now have to worry about seeds. Seeds are extremely easy to find, but they are dependent on the biome and the average temperature of the biome. And some seeds can only be found in certain temperatures, as well as some of them can only be found in ruins. When you're out exploring, you want to be looking for seeds like this on the ground. You just walk over, you smack them a bit, and it might just drop you a seed. So always be on the look for them. Even if you don't think you need them at that point in time, grab them. You'll be very thankful later on. What I would always recommend for your first farm, as you most likely won't have a bucket on hand, is you find a source of water. Your soil will need moisture, and unless you have a water source nearby, you're gonna have to moisture it by hand, which that would require you to clay form a watering can. But this way, you get to just build into an existing water source, like a small lake, a river, a pond. Anything would work. The best way for you to place your land would be like this, in this exact pattern. You just want to keep making 3x3s with the water source in the middle. Since these two are connected, it can be 2 apart. But as there's none back here, we want to end it here. We don't want 2 on this side. By the way, you're also going to need yourself a hoe. That way we can till the land. So the first block that you have the water source next to will be 75%. Then it'll drop down to 50%, to 25%, and eventually 0. You'll notice that the moisture also affects the growth speed, and it'll start at 18%, to 52, to 74, then 88. However, that was just for medium soil, and you can see that Terra preta, the best one, gets 107% growth speed, then 90, then 64, then 22. However, since we were on the topic of nutrients, you can add nutrients to your farms, like making compost. You stick a bunch of rot into a barrel, you seal it up, and over a long period of time, it will give you a small amount of compost. And compost will give you the N nutrient with a little bit of the others. You can find something like saltpeter, which can only be found in caves. And it'll give you the K nutrient with a tiny bit of the N nutrient. Another thing that you can do is you can throw some bones into a quern. Over time, this will give you bone meal, and that will give you the P nutrient. If you found some sylvite, you can also throw that into the corn, and that will give you potash, which will give you the K nutrient, and is insanely nice for stuff like flax. All you have to do with your different kinds of fertilizer is you just right click the soil, it'll add it on, and you can see it says slow release plus 60% K, and it'll last for quite some time, so you don't need to be doing this every day. Now winter is coming, and your crops will die in the winter. However, we have a way around this. We can make greenhouses. Please don't worry about the water here. That is part of a mod. It just makes it look super nice. If you don't plan on using the mod, you just do what I showed you before. That will actually work better than what I have here and be more efficient. But greenhouses are super simple and they can save your crops throughout the winter. If you leave them too long, nothing will save them from that. If you hover over a crop, you can see that it still received cold damage. I left these crops here throughout the entire winter, and the coldest of winter can still negatively affect your crops. However, there is some crops that do better with the cold, and flax is not one of them. However, that being said, it was still worth it to grow these. You can see I still get plenty from them, just not as much as I would have, and I still get my seeds back. Even from the dead flax here, I still get my seeds back. And in some cases, I'm getting multiple flax from these dead crops. So even though that they died, it was still worth it to plant them. But yeah, let me go over greenhouses real quick. They're super incredibly easy to make. All it requires you to do is make less than a 14 by 14 room with a ceiling that is at least 50% glass. It doesn't all need to be glass. You don't need glass walls. They don't affect it whatsoever, but they can look super nice. And if you do that and seal it up, you'll see a little bonus on your crops that will give you an amount of heat and say it's from a greenhouse. By the way, the greenhouse ceiling doesn't necessarily have to be glass. It just needs to be translucent. So if you wanted to, you could even use ice. So if you go on top of a mountain, you can find this stuff called glacier ice. And you don't even need a pickaxe. You can pick it up with your hands. You can bring it back to your base and use that as some sort of window. Perfect for greenhouses. By the way, it will never melt. Glacier ice won't. If you somehow manage to get regular ice, that will. One of my last tips for growing is the way that I set up this greenhouse here is that it's got 4 plots. The reason behind this is so you don't need to use any of the fertilizers. Is every time you plant, you just rotate all the crops in a circle. So you start with N, then it goes to P, then to K, and then on the 4th cycle, you would have nothing here. You leave one of these empty at all times. In the cycle that it's not used, it will regain all of its nutrients back, and it's the easiest way to go about it without having to spend a ton of time trying to get fertilizers. And here's my last tip. Greenhouses don't need to just be for crops. You can use it for beehives or berries, even the fruit trees, or even cattails or tulle. So it's completely up to you what you want to do and how crazy you want to get with it. By the way, greenhouses are not great during the summer. You can see that it adds heat, which is great for winter. However, during the summer, that doesn't magically go away. So it might be damaging your crops during the summer, which can cause some big issues. One of the ways that you can get around it is by just breaking a block. Once it updates, the greenhouse effect will go away and it'll just be like everything was outside and will no longer add that effect. So yeah, I hope this helped. Farming is incredibly easy and it seems like a bit much when you start off, but it really is simple and you just plant stuff and walk away. As long as you don't forget about it, you'll be fine. So anyway guys, thank you so much for joining and I'll see you next time.